In a South Carolina courtroom, after years of investigations, testimony, and psychological evaluations, a jury delivers the ultimate punishment to 37-year-old Timothy Ray Jones Jr., a father convicted of murdering his 5 children. As the sentence is read, the room falls into a heavy silence, one that marks the end of a long legal battle, but only the beginning of the story you're about to hear. What happened before this moment is far more shocking than anyone imagined. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was, to the outside world, the picture of an overworked but responsible father, a man who had full custody of his 5 children, held a stable job as a software engineer, and lived in a quiet South Carolina community where neighbors waved without ever truly knowing the storm forming inside his home. Behind those walls, stress, paranoia, and mental instability simmered beneath the surface as Timothy juggled parenthood alone after a messy divorce, creating an environment where his children, Mara, Elias, Naughton, Gabriel, and Abigail, clung to one another for affection while their father drifted deeper into anxiety and delusion, unable to cope with the mounting pressure he hid so carefully from everyone around him. The custody battle between Timothy and his ex-wife, Amber Kaiser, had been bitter and emotionally draining, ultimately resulting in the court granting primary custody to Timothy due to Amber's unstable circumstances at the time, a decision that would later haunt the legal system as the responsibilities he carried intensified his fragile mental state. Though he insisted he could manage, the reality was far more troubling, as teachers, neighbors, and even acquaintances noticed subtle changes in Timothy. His increasing irritability, strict discipline, and isolating behavior. Yet no one had concrete evidence to intervene, leaving the children caught in the space between their father's worsening psychological state and a support system that failed to recognize the danger in time. Over time, Timothy's mind spiraled into a maze of paranoia fueled by stress, substance use, and pressure he had placed on himself to raise 5 young children alone. And although he maintained his job and outward responsibilities, internally he believed distorted narratives about threats to his family, dangers that did not exist, and conspiracies that only he could protect his children from. His co-workers later described him as intelligent but increasingly erratic, and family members admitted noticing his detachment, yet the children, young, innocent, and dependent, could only watch as their father drifted further into a world of suspicion, where even minor misbehavior became evidence, in his mind, of something sinister. The pivotal moment came on August 28, 2014, when Timothy believed that one of his children, 6-year-old Naughton, had intentionally damaged an electrical outlet, an event that Timothy interpreted not as childish behavior but as a meaningful act that fed into his growing paranoia. And as tension escalated that day, Timothy's psychological state fractured irreversibly, leading him to believe he needed to take drastic action to discipline and protect the family. A tragic misunderstanding that spiraled into a horrifying chain of decisions fueled not by clarity but by a mind overwhelmed by delusion, exhaustion, and mental collapse. In the hours that followed the triggering incident, Timothy's mental breakdown intensified as he convinced himself that what happened in the home required him to take control in a way no rational parent would consider. His thoughts were disorganized, his sense of reality slipping away as he convinced himself that outside forces were watching, judging, or coming for his family, and his emotional restraint dissolved completely. What unfolded that night reflected a deeply unstable man acting not out of reason but from a chaotic psychological episode that blinded him to the humanity, innocence, and love of the 5 small lives depending on him for safety. What followed was a haunting multi-state journey that took Timothy and the bodies of his children from South Carolina through North Carolina, Georgia, and ultimately to Mississippi and Alabama. A desperate, disoriented trek that exposed the full extent of his psychological collapse as he drove aimlessly, slept in parking lots, used drugs to stay awake, and attempted to disguise what had happened while convincing himself he was escaping threats that existed only in his mind. During these days on the road, surveillance cameras captured images of him looking disheveled and disconnected from reality, while the absence of the children sparked panic back home as Amber and the extended family made frantic attempts to contact them. On September 6, 2014, nearly 10 days after the tragedy began, police stopped Timothy at a routine traffic checkpoint in Smith County, Mississippi, where his behavior immediately raised concern. He appeared jittery, confused, and the vehicle carried a sharp, concerning odor that officers recognized as a potential sign of something terribly wrong. Inside, they found blood, children's belongings, and scattered evidence that contradicted Timothy's incoherent explanations, leading authorities to detain him, an act that would ultimately expose the full extent of what had happened to the 5 missing children whose mother had spent days pleading for updates that never came. Once in custody, Timothy's unraveling continued as investigators questioned him, and amid his disorganized, distraught state, he eventually confessed to what he had done, explaining through a fractured narrative that he believed he was protecting his children from dangers only he could see. His statements were filled with paranoia, fear, and confusion, demonstrating a deeply disturbed mental state rather than any coherent rationalization. And though investigators listened carefully, aware that every word mattered, the overwhelming tragedy became undeniable. 5 innocent children were gone, and the father who should have protected them had instead lost himself entirely to a collapsing mind. With the information Timothy provided, authorities located the remains of his children in rural Alabama, in a secluded, wooded area off a dirt road, where he had abandoned them days earlier. The discovery shook the nation and shattered the grieving mother, Amber, as law enforcement and media converged on the site, highlighting a level of tragedy that seemed almost incomprehensible. 5 young lives lost as a result of a father's mental disintegration, system failures, and warning signs that had been dismissed or overlooked long before the tragedy unfolded. Timothy's trial in 2019 became a national focus as prosecutors and defense attorneys debated whether he was legally sane at the time of the murders, a distinction that would determine whether he faced life imprisonment or the death penalty. The defense presented extensive testimony from psychologists who described him as suffering from severe mental illness, chronic paranoia, and delusions exacerbated by stress and substance use, while the prosecution argued that Timothy's attempts to hide the crime, flee the state, and deceive others showed that he understood his actions were wrong. The jury wrestled with not only the facts but also the emotional weight of a father killing his own children, creating one of the most complex legal battles the state had seen in years.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
After weeks of testimony and emotional statements, including heartbreaking accounts from Amber Kaiser, the jury ultimately found Timothy Ray Jones Jr. guilty on all 5 counts of murder, concluding that despite his mental illness, he retained enough understanding and awareness of his actions to be held fully responsible. The sentencing phase was equally wrenching, with the jury eventually determining that the severity of the crime warranted the ultimate punishment, the death penalty, a decision that closed the courtroom chapter but left lingering questions about mental health, parental stress, system failures, and whether this tragedy could have been prevented. Today, Timothy Ray Jones Jr. remains on death row in South Carolina, while Amber Kaiser carries the unbearable grief of losing all 5 of her children at once, a trauma that reshaped her life and sparked ongoing conversations about mental health awareness, parental support, and the need for earlier intervention when signs of psychological decline appear in caregivers. The story of Timothy and his children stands as a devastating reminder that tragedy often unfolds quietly, behind closed doors, where unseen battles, untreated mental illness, and emotional isolation can lead to consequences beyond imagination, urging communities and institutions to recognize the signs before another family falls through the cracks. Every crime leaves a trace, and we're here to follow them. Subscribe for more real, haunting stories you won't forget.